Working on a project car is similar to a war of attrition, and what I mean by that is some weeks you'll win some and some weeks you'll lose some. This week is a fantastic example of this idea. In the last TT episode, we installed coil packs and spark plugs to fix a misfire under wide open throttle. While I was doing that, I noticed that my ignition coil harness was actually failing. This meant that there was an intermittent misfire whenever I adjusted the coil pack wiring, specifically on cylinder 2. I hopped on USP Motorsports and ordered their version of the ignition coil wiring, which is meant to attach to the stock wiring harness. This also came with the tools needed to repin the ECU for this specific harness. This brings me to the first problem of the week, and that is that this harness never ended up fitting the car. Their website listed it as fitting the 225, however, the 225 had a bunch of other electrical connections connected specifically to the ignition system that just weren't on this harness. I'll be reaching out to them to see what the deal is or if they just sent me the wrong product. I will say the toolkit they sent me is in fantastic condition, and the wiring harness looks to be built really well. It's just for a different version of the 1.8T than the one that I have. I still wanted to see if I could come up with a temporary fix, and to do that, I really needed to diagnose and source where the problem of the intermittent misfire was. Since this is an electrical connection and I didn't want to risk anything, I removed the battery and then started to get access to the ignition coils. I don't have a permanent fix for this misfire currently, but I have everything I need in order to diagnose where the actual problem is. My car threw a code for misfire on cylinder 2, so I knew that was where the main problem lied. I also knew that when I adjusted the wiring harness while the car was running, it would either turn on or off the cylinder depending on how it was aligned. Kinda like what old wired headphones are like when one side fails. I had a hunch that one of the 4 wires connected to the ignition coil was either broken or the plastic sheath was gone, which was causing it to interfere with other signals from the corresponding wires right next to it. My guess ended up being spot on. The brown wire with the yellow stripe was cracked. This would leave the copper of that wire exposed with no insulation, which would cause interference depending on how the wire was actually oriented. The wiring on an ignition coil is very temperamental. It needs a very specific amount of current, and it needs it in a specific amount of time. With non-insulated copper this close to a bunch of metal, including other wires controlling the same ignition coil, you're just asking for problems when the plastic ends up bending out of the way. At this point, this is just my current theory as to why this cylinder in this specific spot isn't working, but the crack's there, and it seems like this is the biggest culprit. I can test this by re-insulating the wire and wrapping it in thermal-grade electrical tape for the time being. This is not going to be a permanent fix, but it'll be good enough to get the car to not misfire or determine if that was actually the problem's location. I also took the time while I was in here to check the leads on all of the other ignition coils, and this was the only place where the wire sheath was cracked. This just gives a little more credibility to my theory. I reinstalled all the ignition coil harnesses and put everything back in its right place. While I was reassembling everything, I noticed some weird cracks along the turbo outlet pipe, and I'm really glad that I paid attention to this. The turbo outlet pipe is the first pipe after the turbo compresses the air, meaning that it is one of the most critical in the entire system. Cracks along this one are not good. This one is very old. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's the one that came with the car from the factory. Years of heat cycling have covered it in dirt, debris, and everything in between. I also noticed that my valve cover gasket is definitely leaking, and that'll be something I address in a future video. In this angle, you can see how severe the cracks are on this turbo outlet pipe, and it's making me realize I probably haven't had full boost in this car in a long time. This is a really easy pipe to get to once you have the engine apart this far, so I figured now was as great a time as any to replace it. It's simply held on with a hose clamp on both sides. After this was all set, I reinstalled everything on the engine bay just to make sure the car was drivable. I'm pretty bummed that the wiring harness didn't fit, but it gave us an excuse to put on some of our boost piping,
and we're going to do the rest when we put our front mount intercooler on in the next TT episode. We noticed a crack in the wiring harness for cylinder 2, so we went ahead and re-insulated it with some electrical tape. Hopefully that'll stop it arcing with other cables. We're going to test it and see. This wiring harness was listed to fit the 225, but that's not the case because there's the N249 system and a host of other different cables that should be there but aren't, and I don't really feel like splicing the whole thing when 034 has a kit that I'll just order on the way. This will at least be a temporary fix, hopefully. That at least fixed the misfire, which is good. We'll see how long this fix lasts. Now we're gonna do something a little more fun. We're gonna put some better brakes on this car.
It is finally time to improve the stopping power of the TT. Now my first choice for doing this was to upgrade the calipers at the same time, but I'm gonna save that for a little bit later. I haven't been able to source the caliper upgrade that I want to put on the car quite yet. The current pads and rotors on the car do need changing, however, so this is going to be a fantastic upgrade for the time being. This is PowerStop's Extreme Series. It features carbon fiber ceramic brake pads and their vented, slotted, and drilled rotors. Compared to the stock brakes that are from AutoZone on this car, these are going to be a phenomenal upgrade in the stopping department. Not to mention, I have a hunch they are going to look fantastic behind my new wheels. Brakes are pretty straightforward on the TT since it's fairly old brake caliper technology. Like always, the first step is to jack the car up so you have access to everything. Should go without saying, but once the car is jacked up, it's time to take the wheel off. I've never done brakes on this car, but I've done brakes on a lot of other vehicles. Once you learn how to do brakes on one car, it's pretty simple to figure out how to do them on every subsequent car. That's one of the cool things about working on cars is you learn skills that are useful in more than one situation. For instance, most brake calipers have the actual caliper piston, which houses your pads, that comes off in either 1 or 2 bolts. That's generally what you're going to want to take off first. If you're just swapping pads, this is where you can stop because you can put the new ones in and reinstall. I'm replacing the rotors as well, so I then took the caliper hanger off so that I could get access to the rotor to put the new one on. Some friendly advice, these bolts tend to be some of the worst on the entire car. If your car is at all rusty, I suggest you use penetrating oil on the beginning of this job. That way it has time to set in and free these bolts before you even begin to take them off. My TT225 has never really had a rust problem, so thankfully I didn't have to use too much penetrating oil to get all the bolts off. After you put the new rotor on, you can reinstall everything in the opposite order, making sure to torque things down along the way. I absolutely love the look of the new rotors, but it brings up a really good question. My younger brother came out and asked me why I would choose rotors that already had holes in them. If you don't know much about cars, or if you don't know much about rotors, it's actually really cool why drilled and slotted rotors are so good. These rotors are drilled, slotted, and vented. Each one of those does something pretty different. The holes and vents are on there specifically to cool the rotor down after repeated braking. This lets you brake harder, longer without suffering brake fade where your brakes get too hot to actually operate properly. A lot of people think that the slots on the rotors are also for cooling, but that's not entirely true. The slots on the rotors specifically are designed not to cover the entirety of the brake pad. Whenever a pad is pressed against a brake rotor while it's spinning, it generates a lot of heat, and consequently, as the brake pad gets rubbed off, it gets turned into a gas. This gas can inhibit the brake pad from making complete contact with the rotor itself. These slots allow a channel for that gas to escape the brake rotor and the brake pad, allowing for a more even contact of the brake pad and the brake rotor. This helps with better braking and even wear on the pad and the rotors. The order you do all of the brake pads and rotors on your car doesn't necessarily matter from a mechanical standpoint, but I personally think you should do both fronts and then both rears, and here's why. I work outside on my cars, and I know that's a reality for a lot of car enthusiasts who don't have a garage to work in. Doing brakes is one of those jobs that can take a while when you get stuck on a certain bolt and you have to wait and try different methods to get it loose. If you do the entire passenger side of your car with brakes and you need to drive the car somewhere, you really can't without risking hurting your vehicle. Consequently, I like to do both fronts or both rears at the same time, and then if you have to split the job up, you can do it that way. With experience though, you can definitely get these brakes done in an afternoon, and this happened to have been the first time I was able to do it in one whole day. I just did the brakes on the S4, and I am going notably faster on this and doing a better job overall. It's always fun to see yourself progress at a certain skill, and working on cars gives you plenty of opportunity to do that. When you finish both the front or the rears, I always like to torque them down so you don't forget later. Generally speaking, rear pads and rotors will take a lot less time to do than the front rotors, and that's because they're smaller and use a simpler design. When you step on the brakes in your car, the whole weight is shifted forward onto the front two wheels. Because of this, the front needs a lot more stopping power to actually stop the vehicle, and that's why the front pads are generally bigger. Some, like the S4, even will have more pistons in the front than in the rear. Just like the front, however, the rear has a caliper hanger that we need to remove to get access to the rotors. One thing that's different between the front and back that's noteworthy is that the method that holds on the actual piston itself is a little bit different. The front is held in with 2 hex bolt pins. The rear is held in with 2 opposing nuts that you're going to need to manually remove with 2 wrenches. It's really not as difficult as it sounds. At this point, I was pretty ecstatic. I was making really good pace, and I was on track to finish all 4 brakes in the same day, which is pretty good for me, especially on a car where I've never done the brakes before. Naturally, whenever you announce your confidence towards a specific task, the universe will decide to test you, and this wheel happened to be the most stuck of any of the 4. Pretty ironic if you ask me. I suffered no trouble with rust on all the other wheels, and this one, where I was starting to time myself because I was curious how long it would take, I got a bunch of bolts that were just stuck to the car. In the perspective of the world, that is dramatic irony at its finest, and it is very funny in hindsight. What makes it even funnier is that the rotor was actually fused to the car with a little bit of rust, so I had to use a mallet to remove it. All of this after thinking how awesome this car has been when it came to seized bolts. Thankfully, I was really in no rush, and I was just enjoying the sun and definitely getting sunburned. I'm really grateful that I'm finally able to put better brakes on this car, and I know I haven't upgraded the calipers or gone fully big brake, but I'm happy with this for the time being. This gets me more time to research what I actually want to upgrade these calipers to. If you have any suggestions or setups you like or want to see, let me know in the comments and I'll definitely look into them. I'm pretty paranoid about always torquing down my wheels properly, so I make sure to double and triple check everything with a torque wrench.
Finally done with the brakes. We've got a few things we still need to do. We need to go break them in, and at the same time we're going to test if our temporary fix for the wiring harness is going to work. I'm sure breaking in the brakes is definitely going to cause the problem that was making the misfire happen in the wiring harness, but if that happens, we'll come back. If not, we'll continue breaking in the brakes. Should be fun either way, and I'm very excited to see how much better the TT stops. It's a very long process, but it's worthwhile. Both of these cars are coming together, and I am really excited.
I am absolutely in adoration of the new rotors underneath the new wheels. It really makes this car look like something else. Now it's time to break in brakes, and this may sound weird if you've never put drilled and slotted performance brakes on your car. If you do nothing to break them in, they are actually horrible at stopping your vehicle, so this is a really critical step. The instructions for breaking them in are going to come with whatever pads and rotors you buy, but for me, we have to do a few different things. First things first, you're going to want to get the car to somewhere where you're not around a lot of people, because otherwise people are going to think you're driving like a complete madman, because for the most part you will be. You need to do 5 consecutive hard stops from 40 miles an hour to 10 miles an hour. And I mean you have to stand on the brakes. Then immediately after, you need to do 5 moderate stops from 35 to 5 miles an hour, and you can't come to a complete stop between doing this. After this, you need to do 5 minutes of pretty easy driving to let the brakes cool completely, and then you'll be good to go. If you're doing this, I highly suggest you do it on a back road or in a parking lot or somewhere where you're not risking getting anywhere near other people. It's really well suited for an empty back road.
Now we just need to drive pretty gently for 5 minutes, and that'll be pretty much how far away from home I am, and then we'll be good. We can start loading the tune onto the S4. Today is a busy day. This is a busy weekend. It looks like fixing that crack may have been the fix for the misfire, because it definitely isn't coming back, and we've stopped pretty aggressively a few times, so the engine is considerably jostled. So I'm really hoping that that may actually be the end, but it's probably going to be an ongoing thing, so I'm going to preemptively order the 034 Motorsports kit to replace it ahead of time, just because why not? It's better to be safe than sorry, and I'd rather have it on the way because there's a long wait list. Hopefully it'll behave until then.
I've got a ton of parts on the way for this car, and I'm really excited to put them on over the next few weeks. Some of them include front mount intercooler, as well as a turbo inlet pipe and some coilovers. I feel like we're getting pretty close to being able to take this car autocrossing and seeing what our hard work actually has done. I want to personally say thank you for watching. If you liked the video or enjoyed watching it and learned something, consider dropping a like and subscribing. It tremendously helps my channel out. Thank you again, have a wonderful day.